y dos, y dos, una, y dos, una, y dos.
Hello and welcome to Cortes NYC Livestream, the podcast. This is a bi-weekly show broadcasting out of New York City. We are your hosts, Cortes NYC.
And Carla de Puerto Rico.
And on this show, we talk about art, creativity, city life from a Latino perspective. I'm a visual artist.
And I'm a singer.
And this is episode 15, INKED.
Like always, find us on iTunes and Stitcher. Please subscribe and leave us a review.
And let's give a big shout out to all our people on Instagram, all our active commenters. We got K Dulce, D Menace at 1200, Rockstar Lifestyle, Smurfy 138, Sonny Raimundi 699, Waste IF, NVCK1, Prox1, GWB, Duddy Jr., Fresh Like Gaddy Son, D Double, Brooklyn Wins, VP Records Caribbean, Guillotine Cuts, V-Tree ANK, GCV, Suvio, you throw me off with these, Cheeto Fingers, Bizine Queens, Dr. Greedy, and Abyss 102.
And also a shout out to all our listeners around United States, in New York, Oregon, Wisconsin, New Jersey, California, District of Columbia, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Illinois, and also in Europe, Spain, Sweden, Czech Republic, United Kingdom, Ireland, and Peru.
And we out! Nah, actually we're starting. All right, so, INKED. Well, first of all, Carla.
Yeah. Welcome back.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of interviewing, a lot of people on the show.
Yeah.
And it's been a blast. It's been a lot of fun so far. We're on episode 15. I can't believe it.
I know. It went by very fast.
Yeah. But all the interviews have been fun. Shout out to Alex and to Guillotine Cuts and Nova.
Dr. Greedy.
Dr. Greedy. Yeah, it's been a blast. But so let's get back to business here. Art life.
Yeah.
Let's talk about inking. Inking is something that I've always enjoyed doing from the first time that I was challenged to do a logo. That was where I first started inking. In the 90s, when I graduated from high school, I was approached by different record companies to do logos for rap groups. And back then, I had no computer skills, so I just took my markers and my pens and I started in whiteout, and I would just use the copy machine and draw by hand and make logos with ink. Back then, I was using Sharpies and Pentel pens and whiteout. And little by little, I started developing a style, a good style of inking, where I really knew what I was doing with the black marks and cutting back with the white. And I was doing figures, I was doing lettering, I was doing figures, sometimes like mascot characters, things like that. But I slowly started to develop a respect for actual inking. I started learning more about comic book art and how comic book art is inked and the techniques behind it. And I started getting into working with brush inking. I dabbled in it a little bit back in high school, but I really got into it later on once I started working. And I was asked to do some cartoon characters, and I started doing t-shirts, and then I really had to do a lot of inking then. When I first started, I was using, like I said, I was using markers and whiteout. The markers that I would use, I said, was Sharpie. I used a lot of, Pentel has a marker called a sign pen, which a sign pen is like a medium, to me it's like a medium weight of a tip. It's very flexible tip, it's very spongy. And it, for some reason, the way they designed it just lets out a lot of ink. So you can really get some fast sketching done. You get nice, rich, dark coverage. And then for sharper lines, I would use a Pilot Razor Point. That was my favorite pens. Those are the pens that I would use if I needed to do something quick. If somebody was like, yo, I need some characters done fast, or if I was working at my full-time job and I need to do cartoon characters quickly, I would use those pens because they would get the marks down fast, and I knew that I can count on getting more if they ran out. It was very easy for me just to go get another one from the box. It wasn't a big deal. I didn't have to refill anything or, get ink and put a brush and put a nib. those tools are really good for fast things like that. And especially back then when if you were going to scan the artwork anyway, it didn't matter if it was a fine, beautiful inking, because you would scan it into the computer, you could raise up the contrast. It didn't really matter. But then later on, I went back to some of the things that I learned in high school but never really practiced, which was ink brush techniques, and croco pen techniques and rapidograph techniques. A rapidograph is like a technical pen. It's like a fine point pen, but it's a mechanical pen. And it's a metal nib, and you have to fill it in with ink with a dropper. It's very messy. It's old school. It's from back in the 70s and 80s. My father used to use those when he was doing architecture. This is what people used to use before computers. They used technical pens. I mean, for a professional working as an architect, doing straight lines or any kind of graphing or mapping, that's the tools that they would use because they were so sharp and precise, and they would last long because it was pure ink. They would use real India ink in it. But it's just very slow. If you're sketching quickly, you can scrape the paper by mistake, and that's where it's very, because it's ink in a metal tip, it can leak if you're moving around your hand too quickly.
Right.
So that's why I never really held on to that tool. But then when I started getting back into it and I started slowing down a little bit and trying to learn how to use that tool, it actually proved to be very useful to get some really interesting lines, nice line work, and sharp, steady lines. I started experimenting with that, and then also with croco pens, which a croco pen is a nib tip pen. It's a dipping pen. It's a pen that you have to dip into some sort of cup with ink, right? And usually you would use black India ink for that. Croco pen, I think, is interesting because it can give you different variation of line weights, and it gives you a very staggered kind of inconsistent line work. So it's really good if you're sketching, if you know how to use it, if you practice using it. These tools that I'm talking about now are tools that you really do have to practice. Mm-hmm. The rapidograph, the croco pen, you have to get a feeling for how the nib hits the paper. You can't go backwards. You can't go in every direction like a rolling ball tip or like a marker. You can't go in every direction. If you start to go backwards, like move up, you'll scrape the paper and it'll splatter ink everywhere. So you have to work in one direction, maybe two, but you always have to be aware of how you're stroking the nib against the paper. But because it's pure ink being laid down with a steel tip, you get a very rich black line. And that inconsistent wobbly line that you get is very reminiscent of old illustrations from books. All the old comics from like the 70s and the 60s, all like the old newspaper comic strips, they were done with croco pens because they would give you that interesting sketch line. So it looked like it was done by a pencil, but it was very rich and black, so they couldn't print it. So it gave it a human touch, but it was still, laying down good ink.
Yeah.
So the croco pen is another good pen. The only problem with that, again, is that it's messy. And this is even worse. If you're not careful, you can knock over your ink, which happened to me many times. You can accidentally drop ink from your pen onto the paper, which has happened to me many times, until I started understanding how much ink I needed on the tip. And because of the metal tip, you can even actually accidentally stab yourself if you're not paying attention, because it's a sharp tip. So it's something that you gotta really get a feeling for it. You gotta have a respect for the tool. But I think it's a fun tip. Whenever I want to do some inking sketch, some ink sketches that are kind of like a brainstorm, and I just want to try something different, and I just want to feel something different, a different kind of line texture and all that, croco pens is what I use. And because of the type of tip that it is, it gives you really good cross hatching also, which is another additive. It makes your sketch really feel like a sketch, not a technical illustration. And then the other tool that I use that I really enjoy, and it's the one that I feel is like the premier inking tool, is a brush. Preferably, I would say a liner brush. That's what they're called. It would be a watercolor brush, any brand, it doesn't really matter, as long as it's a watercolor brush and it's a liner. The liners are the best, and you can go from a 0 tip to a 1, or maybe sometimes a 00 if you want to get really fine. But if you're really good at learning how to use the brush, you can probably get away with a 1 or even a 2, depending on how much weight you put on the brush. The beautiful thing about inking with a brush, and this is what I enjoy the most, is that a brush line can go on for a long distance. You can load up a brush and you can apply a stroke, and it can apply long, broad strokes that you can't really do with a marker. For some reason, with a marker, the type of stroke that you get is like it can go for a certain distance, but you kind of stop. With a brush, because of the angle, the way that you kind of like sweep the brush across the paper, you can go for a longer distance and get a more consistent, longer stroke. And a brush, if you want to do short dabs, you'll get big blotchy splatters or spots of ink that are very consistent as well, because the brush lays down ink consistently. Compared to a marker where you're going to do little lines and try to fill in an area, a brush, you can lay it down heavy and it'll fill it in one solid shot. So you get a nice flat jet black ink. Another thing about working with a brush is the type of ink you use. I like to use, and I recommend a lot for inking with a brush, black sumi ink, not to be confused with black India ink. Black sumi ink is Japanese. The brand that I use is Yasutomo, and it tends to have, for me, I like it because it tends to have a jet black finish without the chalky texture that black India ink sometimes gets. The sumi ink lays down flatter on the paper, and also the sumi ink does not, if you're gonna add marker, like if you're gonna color your inking, the sumi ink, if you let it dry, let's say for a few hours, it won't smudge. Black India ink sometimes will smudge with a marker. If you lay down marker on top of it, you'll end up rubbing the black India ink off the paper and it'll start smudging around. The sumi ink is very smooth and it dries flat and it doesn't smudge. So that's another reason why I like using the black sumi ink with brush. Those are the tools. Those are the basic tools. Oh, and the paper. Let's talk about the paper. I forgot about the paper. The paper I usually use is Bristol paper. It can be smooth, or it can be what they call either a plate finish or a vellum finish. So it could be smooth or it could be textured. I don't have a preference. Sometimes I like to ink on textured. I think it's fun to switch around. So I think it all depends on how you feel that day. That's for me. There's no preference. I've also inked on smooth, like copy paper. I was doing that for a long time when I used to work at this company and we were doing inking a lot within the art department. I would use the laser copy paper, which would absorb. It wasn't that great, let's say, if I wanted to keep these drawings for a long time, but because these were supposed to be disposable, I was just gonna ink and then scan the art and then color it. It didn't really matter if the paper was flimsy. But what I did like about it was that the smooth finish on the copy paper, on the laser copy paper, it would give me a really sharp line with the ink, and it wouldn't allow the ink to bleed. And that was really good. I enjoyed that a lot. And because the paper was thin, I can sketch on one piece of paper, put another piece of paper on top, and then ink right onto that, and kind of see my sketching underneath. Usually we would use light boxes to make it easier to see the sketch underneath. But the paper was just it was a lot easier to like not commit to a big old Bristol paper. But if you're gonna do a piece of art that you really want to make it last long and you want to maybe even frame it and use it as a piece of fine art, then I would recommend Bristol paper or even something thicker, which you can go to any art supply store and get like a lot of different types of paper weights and textures and stuff like that. If you really want to get into something for long term, then I would get into illustration board, which, I've inked on illustration board and I could see the difference as well, because you don't get the buckling. And I guess that'll come into my do's and don'ts in inking, right?
Yes.
When you're inking, it's got water in it, right? That's the solvent, is liquid water. If you put too much ink at one time, the paper will start to buckle. It'll start to wrinkle because you're wetting the paper as you're inking. And if you're inking too much at one time, you'll end up warping all your paper. And that's why it's better sometimes to do illustration board or Bristol board, because you'll avoid warping the paper. But if you know how to control the amount of water or ink, quote unquote, that you're putting onto the paper, you can do a little bit at a time, and you can work with thinner paper. It just depends on your level of knowledge of how much water to paper you should add, you know. Now, when you're gonna start a project, you want to have all your pencils laid down first. And that's something I had to learn when I first started inking cartoon characters, was that I would try to sketch and I would get bored of sketching because I was like, well, I'm gonna ink this anyway, so why do I have to sketch everything? And I would just sketch slightly, and then I would let it go, and I'd be like, all right, I'm gonna start inking. And I would just start inking some of it. And that was a mistake. I learned later on that the best inking is done when you sketch everything completely first and have the patience to see all the line work through. If you look at the sketching as a practice for your inking is gonna be better because you gave yourself the opportunity to practice and to kind of pinpoint where are the long strokes, where are the short strokes, where's the cross hatching, where's the solid shapes. So sketching everything is good. I like to sketch when I'm gonna ink. I like to use a harder pencil. Sometimes like a 2H is good for me because it doesn't leave a heavy mark on the paper, and it's easier for me to erase later. And when I ink, it just basically covers it all up, and I don't really see the pencils underneath. When you're gonna sketch, try to sketch the most detail that you can, but without laying down too much pencil on the paper. So you wanna get all your details down, but don't oversaturate the paper with pencil marks, because that will ruin your inking. It'll make your inking harder to be clean. You know, it'll make it messier. And a good inking is always a clean inking. You don't want it to be messy. Another tip that I can give you about inking is try to lay down your thin lines first. When you're inking, give yourself that wireframe thin line to isolate all the contours, all the line work. Get them as accurate as possible, as smooth as possible. But if you go thin, remember that you could always go thicker. When you're inking, you want to lay down from thin to thick. You want to lay down all your thin lines first, because you could always fill in heavier and heavier. You can't take away ink unless if you want to use white out or white paint. But the best inking is done without any white paint. The best inking is done all just pure ink. That's when it really looks really crisp, and it gives people the illusion that it's printed. I've had people look at my inks, my original inks, and ask me if it's a copy or not. Like,
Yeah.
is this an original or is this a laser cut? Like, you've seen some of my inking.
Yeah, I've seen your inking, and it's crazy because it looks like it's a work that you done in the computer, and I think that you have mastered the work with ink a lot.
Yeah, I didn't set out to become a really good inker, or even to be a comic book inker, but I just developed that skill and actually learned to enjoy it. Like I said, it's meditative for me. Like, I haven't inked in a while, but when I do ink, I sit down and I get lost in it. I get lost in the cross hatching. I get lost in all the little shapes that you start to make. And I know I have the patience now because I've developed the skill. I have the patience to sit there and ink something over a period of 2 or 3 days, and I won't lose my patience. I know that I can play that game nice and steady, and that at the end it's going to be worth it.
Right.
And I think that's something that inking teaches you as an artist. It teaches you to slow down and to think about a bigger plan. It makes you think about the whole composition. It makes you think about the bigger picture at the end. Where sometimes if I'm using spray paint or if I'm using oil paint, I'm not thinking like that. I'm just going nuts and just laying down color and laying down this and that. Inking, I really enjoy inking because it makes me only think about the shapes, the lines, the black and white, and that's it. And I don't have to think about color. I can empty my brain of color or any other like things that are in my head of like, you know, what might be difficult in the piece.
Yeah.
And I guess another thing is that when you're inking, you know that at the end, it's gonna be something that is impactful.
Right.
You know, it's got that high contrast.
Do you use inking or have you done inking for graffiti pieces? Or you've done it for anything, characters and graffiti pieces, or?
Well, one of the best examples of inking that I documented was Savage Sword, which was a black book that I did in Mears's black book, Mears 1. I did a piece in his black book, and I recorded it. I put it on YouTube. If you guys want to check it out, go to youtube.com/CortesNYC. Look for Savage Sword. And that I recorded step by step the inking process, and I used all types of different tips and brushes and all that. And you really see what I'm talking about in that video. But that's an example of inking where I did it for graffiti style. But I've inked for T-shirts. I designed tattoos where I designed the characters, you know, the skulls and whatever, and then they use that for a tattoo. I've inked for logos, right, where I've actually inked characters and things that become logos. I mean, inking is something that I don't think is going to go away as long as now I do inking in the computer, yeah, with vector shapes. But I still think that there's something to inking that I don't think will go away as long as people are looking at that jet black. I guess it's the minimum that you could do, right? It's a black mark on a white paper. Yeah. And that's what people want to see. I think another thing about inking is the scale of it. Usually when you ink, you go small and you go very detailed. It's rare that you see giant, inkings. I think that might be something I might explore later in life. I might explore doing some really large scale inkings to see how that would look. Yeah,
I think the only time when I saw something that it was super big and it was ink, it was when I went to the Met Museum, and they had an exhibition for, I believe it was Chinese writing. So they had these huge papers of Chinese writing, and they use ink. But that's the only time I've seen it, not actual, let's say, art with characters or something different.
Yeah, I mean, in the United States, inking became really popular because of the printing press, especially comics and newspapers, because that was the way that they can actually get illustrations printed with one color, for cheap. And they knew that they can photograph it and reproduce it very cleanly compared to a painting or a sketch or a pencil sketch or something like that. So it became popular for that. And I think once computers came into play, people kind of walked away from it a bit. But I think even now with the tattoo, frenzy that everybody's into tattoos, and it's just so normal to get a tattoo and to be into tattoo culture, I think inking is got a home within that culture.
If you want to make a tattoo or learn how to tattoo, you need to know how to ink.
Yeah, and also I just think even if it's not for your tattoo, the aesthetic is similar, that people can appreciate an ink drawing.
Yeah.
And I think, one last thing I would say is if you're gonna get into inking, there's a lot of books on inking. Study all kinds of inking if you're gonna learn inking. Don't just study comic book inking. Study old classic inking, illustrations and wood carvings and Japanese art, Chinese art, where they're using inking and old hieroglyphic style of inks, like things like that where you can see the line work and the symbols, coming to life. That's the kind of stuff that I studied that allowed me to kind of see it as the bigger picture of inking, not just comic books and cartoons, and that helps. Good luck, inkers.
Pero si no estás haciendo todo igual, no tiene ningún color el paso que hace. Separa menos tiempo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 y 10.
Culture talk.
Wow. Culture talk. culture time.
Wow, Carla. Wow. Carla, culture talk.
Yeah.
Now, this is un culture talk verdadero.
Este es un culture talk cultural de lo más culturales.
Word. Because today you're bringing the culture.
Yes,
right?
yes.
For us ignorant people who don't read, you're bringing the culture.
I mean, let's be real. Well, I was thinking back to my school years, and when I went to school, I used to read the books that they will send me to read from school, whatever, right? And I always remembered the magic realism style of writing.
Which it's kind of a cliche, right?
Yeah.
For Latino authors, and if you're gonna be an author, it's like they're expecting you to do magical realism.
Exactly. And it's interesting because it is always related to South America and Latin America, but we have to say that the style of magic realism writing is not only from Latin America. It had gone through Germany, Canada, Europe, and now I feel like not everybody, but the writers that are coming up are mixing a lot of a kind of magic realism in their writing.
When they talk about magical realism, what are the authors that they really speak about? Like who are like the main authors? That's what we're here to talk about.
Yeah.
Just give me some names.
So Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Okay.
The
most famous one, probably.
He's the
right?
most famous one, yeah. Isabel Allende.
Okay. I've heard that name.
I think it's Jose Luis Borges.
Okay.
His last name is Borges.
And so when it comes to magic, I mean, are you a fan of magical realism?
I think it's the only style that actually got my attention when I was going to school.
Why?
And I was reading it. Because it was a different feel. Like in school, they send you to read a lot of history, Don Quixote, stuff like that. And that's very dense. It's a very dense reading.
Okay.
But reading magical realism is like make you feel as if the world that you're living in is actually magical.
Right.
Even though what you're reading is actually kind of like a fantasy, but they mix real elements with magic.
What I don't understand about that is how is that not surrealism? That always confused me.
Right.
Magical realism compared to surrealism.
Yeah.
Always confused me. But I'm not an expert, so I can't debate
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
All right, so give us an example. What do you have? What examples do you have of Latin American authors that are magical realism?
Yeah, I mean, starting with Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which is like the father of magical realism in Latin America. So he's a Colombian novelist, a short story writer, screenwriter, and journalist. He is considered one of the most significant authors of the 20th century and one of the best in Spanish language. And his best known novels are 100 Years of Solitude, The Atoms of Patriarch, and Love in the Time of Cholera. I haven't read those books, but I read the story of a shipwrecked sailor and Chronicle of a Death Foretold. So in Spanish will be El relato de un náufrago y Crónica de una muerte anunciada. So for me, El relato de un náufrago was the one that actually got me because this book.
So, and I had to learn when you described this to me. A náufrago is a shipwrecked person.
Yeah.
A castaway, basically.
Basically, yeah.
Okay. So the story's about what?
So the story is about there's a ship, I believe it's leaving from the United States, and on its way, an accident happened, and everybody on the ship dies except this one guy. So the story is about his journey all alone in just one boat, trying to get back to the place he was supposed to go, which I think it was Colombia. And then the thing about the way that Gabriel Garcia Marquez described his journey is that he really goes into detail of how he felt and how he had to talk to himself to keep himself sane, because he was all alone in the ocean trying to get to whatever he was going to get, because at that point he didn't have a map either, or a way to communicate to anybody else. So I feel like that story got me because I actually felt what the character was feeling, and then it was a very easy reading and it was easy to follow too. So it got me like into actually paying attention to the reading, which is for me is very difficult. I get very distracted. So
well, I can't read it unless it's got a fucking spaceship or no bullshit. All right, listen. I mean, to be honest, I don't read fiction books. Mm-hmm. The only book that ever stayed with me in my head was back in junior high school. It was a series of books called The Dark is Rising, and it was a collection. It was like, imagine like a Harry Potter book, but before Harry Potter. And it was Dark is Rising, and it was about a kid that he came across like some pendulant that connected him to like the ancient whatever, and it gave him powers and some shit or whatever. He was like an old soul, in a young kid's, resurrected in a young kid's body. Whatever. That was the only book that I ever really bothered reading that was fiction. Besides that, yes, I do read, and I realize that I do read. I read a lot of books related to my craft.
Yeah.
Related to art, related like how-to books and books that will inform me.
Right.
Not so much books on nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
So this subject was interesting to me because you chose to do a subject that was a little challenging. It got me curious about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, especially because he's the only one that really stands out to me as being somebody that I know. Doesn't mean that he's the best. It just means that it's the only name I recognize, really. Yeah. And I did see one of the movies, in time of... The Love in Time of... Cholera. Right. And it was like a novela. Yeah. It was like a very dramatic novela. It had some famous actors in it. Mm-hmm. But it was a novela. I don't know. Like, I don't think that movie would do anything to encourage me to read Gabriel Garcia Marquez's books. Yeah. You describing to me this short story or a short book. And it's not a short story, but it's a short book about a shipwrecked guy or a castaway. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Like, I like to see that movie. You know what I mean? The thing about, these first two books, this one, The Shipwrecked Sailor and The Chronicle of a Death Foretold, these two books are actually very in a journalistic style. So I think that's another thing that got me, because it's almost as if these things actually happen because they're based in real events. And he took it... They're really based in real events? Yeah. Based on a true story, really? Yeah. So he took it and he managed to basically convert it into a novel. That makes me think of those Latin American movies where it feels like they're talking about regular or real life. And then all of a sudden magical shit happens. Exactly. You know, at somewhere in the middle, the grandma flies away. Yeah. Or somewhere in the middle, she opens a door in her bedroom and it opens to another magical something. La Rosa de Guadalupe. Right. And then she ends up coming, but then she comes right back to normal reality. But it's a little scene of fantasy. Right. I mean, Pan's Labyrinth. Exactly. That's really fantasy, but it has some magical realism. I feel because it comes from a reality, and because it's mixing history with the magical elements of a girl and her imagination. Yeah. So, and that's another thing that when I was researching about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, they were saying that
the thing about his writing is that he's mixing elements and actual realities from his culture, from Colombia, from the history of Colombia, and then mixing it with the reality of society and the magical elements that happen in society because of the background of the culture. So because of religious ideologies or the customs and the traditions, this creates like a magical elements in the story.
So why is it so popular in Latin America? Is it because people of color are so magical? Or is it because we just fantasize too much, we daydream too much?
I think that it's a way to tell the stories, because the majority of the authors and the famous authors from Latin America, they touch on political events that happen in the country. So I think in order for them to talk about these events without being so political, they use the magical thing and the thing that, I'm gonna be funny, I'm gonna be this is gonna be like an adventure, but I'm mixing elements of the reality of what's happening in this country.
As an artist, I can say that yes, I can see where if you're going through quote unquote the struggle, or if you're going through things that you can't really speak about because you're kind of being put in a position of silence most of the time. I can see that would mean that it's safer for you to add fantasy to kind of cover up what you're really trying to say.
Exactly.
I can see that. Maybe that has a tie to magical realism and Latin America, where there's been so much political issues, social issues, moral issues, being very conservative morally and spiritually, religiously,
Yeah, and there's a lot of criticism also, even to religion, the same religion that they use as the magical aspect. They also point out that the negative stuff of religion in society and family structure and all this. So yeah, I think that's definitely an element.
All right, so why don't you give us some of the list that you got? What are the names?
Okay, so I have, for the magical realism style, I had Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and then now I have Isabel Allende. So Isabel Allende is a Chilean writer. Her works sometimes contain aspects of the magical realism genre. She's famous for novels such as The House of the Spirits and City of the Beast. Allende has been called the world's most widely read Spanish language author.
Wow.
And Allende's novels are often based upon her personal experience and historical events, and paid homage to the lives of women while weaving together elements of myth and realism.
Well, yeah, myth, I guess, is another element, right?
Yeah, exactly. Mixing all these elements that make a society. And I think us as the Latino culture in Latin America, there's a lot of myths and a lot of
superstitions,
myth,
yeah. I could see that.
So I think all this is also mixed in the stories that they want to tell. And sometimes they're even trying to fight those superstitions, to say, but you see, this is not really real.
The magical realism thing, I mean, like I said, you're bringing us into books here, and that's difficult. I'm glad you're doing it. I know. Listen, I'm glad you just raised the IQ level of this podcast a lot right now. You just raised the level up a lot. You made us college grads now, but
I mean, this is also for me. This is this list. I want to keep reading a little bit more in Spanish, because now I'm going to school here in the United States. I feel like I'm losing my Spanish a little bit.
Well, there's audiobooks on YouTube, so I could recommend that as well if you're lazy to read.
I know.
You can just listen to the audiobooks on the train ride in, ride out, and you got the book in your head then.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say was, you are challenging me right now, me specifically sitting next to you, to learn a little bit more about these authors, because now I'm curious. This magical realism thing makes me think about all the Spanish movies, because I'm a movie buff. It makes me think of all the Spanish from Spain or Latin American movies that have these magical elements in this story that is being told in a very narrative, straightforward, realistic way, and then suddenly have a weird twist. You know, they tend to like to do that, right? Where they'll give you this odd little twist at a certain point, and you're like, well, what the fuck was that about? And then you just swallow it because you're like, all right, well, it's weird, it's Latin, and it's just weird, you know?
Yeah, I think that the perfect example of magical realism, as in movies, Pedro Almodóvar in Spain. As a director,
yeah,
he is the man for magical realism in movies from Spain. If you see, I don't know if you remember Volver with Penelope Cruz.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's magical realism right there.
Yeah.
You see that the mom supposedly died, then she's not dead, they killed the guy. All this crazy shit is happening, and it's supposedly happening in reality.
And I guess the fact that the mom died but she's not dead, and it leaves you the way that the author, or let's say in this case the director presents it to you, makes you question whether you just saw something magical or
something crazy,
or is there something crazy and it's real.
Exactly.
It can happen, but it's crazy. These people are crazy, or it's something that just really is magical. For me, the magical movies that I can imagine that pop into my head, like I said before, like Water for Chocolate.
Oh yeah, that's also magic realism.
A lot of poetry in there, a lot of weird magical shit that happens. Like it's playing like a straightforward story, and then you have some magic shit that happens. The Frida movie.
Yeah.
With Salma Hayek, Frida.
Yeah.
That one has a ton. I mean, she's an artist. She's portraying an artist, so I get it. But it still weaves a lot of poetry, visual poetry.
So, okay, and then I have two other authors that I just wanted to throw out there because I know that you guys might know them. They're not necessarily part of the magical realism style, but they're very known and they're very important too to the Latino community. So the next one is Paulo Coelho, and he's a Brazilian lyricist and novelist and the recipient of numerous international awards. He's best known for his widely translated novel The Alchemist and other novels like Veronica Decides to Die, The Sahir, and Alep. So Paulo Coelho, I actually think that I've heard that he's a little bit overrated. This is the author that I've heard a lot of people saying.
Facts.
That
calling him out.
Yeah, I mean, I think I read the Alep. I think that was a very short book that I think I read some of it. But almost all his books are about motivational, inspirational things, like look for the goal, like look for your goals and follow your goals and follow your dreams. So I feel like, and they're easy to read, I've heard that too. So I feel like a lot of people have said that they don't understand why everybody loves him because he's not the big deal.
Right.
And then to finish, but this is, I think, one of the most important writers. Her name is, well, she's a poet, but her name is Julia de Burgos.
Julia de Burgos.
Yes. So she's a Puerto Rican poet. She was an advocate of Puerto Rican independence and was also a civil rights activist for women and Afro-Caribbean writers. Some of her most known poems are Poema para mi muerte, my death poem.
Wow, that's dark.
Yo misma fui mi ruta, I was my own path. Alba de mi silencio, dawn of my silence.
Okay.
So Julia de Burgos is a very important poet for Puerto Ricans, and I feel the Caribbean in general. She really opened up a space for Afro-Caribbean poets to write in a very this was a long time ago, right? So I feel like she opened up doors for a lot of women also to feel empowered and to feel like they have the power to do whatever they want, to write about whatever they feel, and to be free. And Julia de Burgos was an activist for Puerto Rican independence too. And I feel like she is a very important part of our culture that sometimes it gets forgotten. Like, yeah, we forget about her. And we forget about the impact of her work. A lot of people in the Caribbean, most in the Dominican Republic, got to know her and got to know her work. And yeah, so she's another author. And from her, you can read her poems. They're short. I think there's some that has been translated into English. And they're very intense. She was a very intense poet, and her poems also always was talking about her freedom, but also like the way she had to fight with society for her to find a place as an independent woman, but also that she had to be part of what society was telling her she had to be. So to be a mom, or to be a sister, or to be a caregiver, and all this. Julia de Burgos definitely put a mark in the history of Puerto Rico and the culture of Puerto Rico.
Something that I would want to point out is just these authors that are creating these famous authors that are from Latin America that are creating these books, they were way ahead of their time. They were challenging probably the norms that other authors were doing, which was probably straightforward fiction with a character, a story, a plot, very straightforward storytelling, and they probably were having fun.
Yeah, like all styles, they come fighting something from the last style, like in art.
Yeah.
With modernism and postmodernism and all this. So I think, it's the same thing.
But I'm sure, like, at this point, because we're so far into it, I'm sure a lot of movies have made that magical element seems very light in the books now. You're used to the movies that show you so much craziness that when you go to a book, it doesn't seem so crazy. Right? So when you probably see these books now, you probably don't get so impressed. You're
exactly.
Like, it's no big deal. But I would say for movies that they're not magical realism, but they make me think along these lines. This is Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And it's a movie that starts off feeling like it's a regular old-fashioned kind of movie where these guys are breaking out of prison. But little by little, that you start to see these fantastic elements coming into play in the scenes. And then you realize that you're in some sort of weird, surreal fantasy. And I would say it's magical kind of realism where you're not in reality. This movie was actually based off of the old Greek mythologies of the Odyssey. And they just took the old story of the Odyssey and they updated it to modern times. And that's why it felt so fantasy, is because they told the story of these guys breaking out of prison, but it was basically retelling that old thing. And then another director that always is just fantasy and reality, and it's really fantasy, it's crazy, is Aronofsky. Darren Aronofsky is the guy. He's the guy who did The Fountain.
Okay, yeah.
I believe
that's like an intense magical realism.
Well, I mean, it's fantasy, but he mixes it.
But that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's why it's like another level. If you can have magical realism and then you have an upper level of magical realism, that's where The Fountain is, because it does mix reality and the situation that the guy is going on with this fantasy world that he's living in.
Yeah, like he's the same guy who did Black Swan.
Oh yeah.
He's the same guy. He goes dark.
Yeah,
though. He goes
yeah.
dark, but it's
But
that,
it is, yeah.
Requiem for a Dream. You haven't seen that one yet, but Requiem for a Dream is another one that gets really weird. It's like a regular movie, and then all of a sudden it takes you into this other reality.
Yeah, and I think that it is true what you're saying. After you have seen it visually with your eyes, but you have seen the whole concept
With
visually with the
music.
music that you don't have to imagine anything, that everything is given to you as magical and realistic.
Yeah.
Then when you go back to the book and you have to do all this work just by reading the words, imagining everything, yeah, I can see that you're gonna be like, no, I'm not really gonna do this.
We have to look at Black Swan again, but I remember Black Swan.
No, Black Swan was crazy.
But it was like, it's a ballerina.
But it was, yeah.
It's a story about a ballerina.
And it's her struggles.
But you're going into her consciousness,
Exactly.
her psyche.
Yeah,
And maybe that's where Latinos got that magical realism, is in their psyche.
exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed this section of literature talk.
Literary studies and magical realism. Thank you.
You wanted me to teach you, right? This is street reality.
Hablando español, Carla.
Yes, hablando español. Hablando español.
What do you got for me? What are you going to teach me? Teach me some Spanish.
Okay, so first one, how do you say inking?
Inking. Inking or ink?
Inking.
Inking. Bueno, ink is tinta. So inking would be tinteando?
Casi.
What is it?
Entintando.
Entintando.
Yeah, I know. I really didn't know that one either.
Entintando sounds like intentando.
Entintando.
Entintando. All right, entintando, inking. Next.
Okay, next one. Next one is, how do you say tools?
Tools. Oh, that one throws me off every time. Herramienta.
Herramientas.
Say it again.
Herramientas.
Herramientas.
But it can also be los instrumentos.
Tools. Instrumentos. Herramienta. Instrumentos I would use.
Yeah, it's instrumentos.
Instruments. Tools or instruments. Instrumentos.
More than
yeah. Herramientas.
Because herramientas is more like the hammer.
Hardware.
Yeah.
Herramientas hardware. Okay.
Okay.
Dale, instrumentos. Got it. I'm so Spanish right
Okay.
now. I'm so Spanish. I'm sick with it. I'm sick with the Spanish.
The next one is sharp.
Sharp. Ooh. Wow, you're getting me. Sharp, puntudo. Afilado.
Puntiagudo.
Puntiagudo. There's like 3 words. Fuck Spanish. I quit.
No, I actually, yeah, but it,
Okay,
exactly.
so sharp can be puntudo. Like if somebody como
puntiagudo.
tiene punta.
Puntiagudo.
Si tú le sacas la punta a un lápiz, it's a sharp pencil. It's puntudo. It's
Puntiagudo.
puntiagudo.
Yeah.
Okay. Puntiagudo is sharp like a pencil. Puntiagudo.
Then it can be also definido.
Definido sharp.
Definido. Una
Oh,
línea
something
definida.
that's
Like
sharp,
a
defined.
like
Sharp.
a sharp line.
Okay. Defined. Definido.
And it can also be fine, but I'm not gonna use fine for sharp. Fine in Spanish, which is fino.
And what was the other word that you said before?
Puntiagudo.
Puntiagudo, and there was another one.
And definido.
Definido. Sharp. Okay.
So let's use sharp. It's gonna be puntiagudo
Puntiagudo, because I'm talking about sharp pencils and sharp
and
lines.
definido.
And definido. Definido.
Definido.
Definido, got it.
And then, how do you say fine?
Fine. Fino.
Oh, okay. How do you say brush?
Brocha.
Oh, yes.
Come on, man.
How do you say
Yes.
Japanese art?
Arte japonesa.
Japonés.
Oh, japonés. Arte japonés?
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. How do you say tattoo?
Tatuaje.
Ooh.
Got that one. Come on, man. That's
yes.
no brainers. Come on.
How do you say Symbols.
Symbols, símbolos.
Yes. How do you say authors?
Authors is autores.
How do you say magical realism?
Magical realism. Realismo mágico.
Yes. Really? How
the
do you
most.
say short story?
Short story. Cuento corto.
Just cuento.
Cuento is short story. Cuento.
Yeah.
Okay. As opposed to a long story, which is what?
A novel.
But that's a novela.
Yeah.
Novel, novela, short story is a cuento?
Yeah.
All right. So back in the day, I'm sure Gabriel Garcia Marquez, when he was writing his novel, his novels,
Yes.
he sat down. He didn't have a computer.
No.
He sat down on a machine to write, on a typewriter. How do you say typewriter in Spanish?
Maquinilla.
No.
Yes.
¿No es máquina de escribir?
Well, I've heard always que es la maquinilla.
Maquinilla.
I don't know if that's a Puerto Rican thing, but
Yeah, because
a
that just sounds
maquinilla.
like machinish, like a little machine, a maquinilla. It doesn't mean typewriter,
Well,
but it might be.
it might be.
You want to check your Google search?
Yeah, let me Google search. Tell me the next one. What's the next one? So, the typewriter, following Google Translation, es una máquina de escribir.
Máquina de escribir. That's what I said, Carla. Come on, you have to listen to the Colombian here because you know the Colombian Spanish.
I hate you.
All right. There was a word that you taught me during this episode. Shipwreck.
Yeah.
How do you say shipwreck in Spanish?
Náufrago.
Say it again.
Náufrago.
Naufrago. I have never in my goddamn life used or heard the word naufrago. Naufrago is shipwrecked.
Yes.
That sounds nothing like shipwrecked.
You see, that's why you need to learn that word.
Is naufrago because it's nautical,
I feel so young.
but it's frago is like a failure, like a nautical failure?
Might be.
Naufrago.
Yeah.
And we got another episode in the bag.
Woohoo!
Seamless. Episode 15 done.
Yep.
That's how we do. Like Cardi B.
How we do? Cardi B. In the street.
All right, so next episode is going to be episode 16. Born Fly.
Woohoo!
We're going to have a special guest next episode, which is Damian Dolly. He is an old friend of the show, old personal friend, and old collaborator. Great designer with a great fashion sense. He's going to be here to talk to us about his career and his current state in the fashion industry.
And because he loves football, soccer, we're going to be talking about football, some soccer players that we love, and we're going to be hablando español.
At the end, as always, yeah.